Welcome to the 225th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. Stay tuned for my interview with Tim Powers. World Fantasy Award-winning science fiction and fantasy author, Tim Powers is the author of Last Call, The Anubis Gates, On Stranger Tides, Declare, and many other novels. Stay tuned for the interview. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Tim Powers, author of the new novel Medusas Web. Powers is the author of many novels, including Earthquake Weather, Expiration Date, Last Call, and On Stranger Tides. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Sure. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about Medusas Web yet, how would you describe your new novel?
Oh, let's see. It's a supernatural adventure involving an old decaying mansion in the Hollywood Hills, which the inhabitants are being plagued by consequences from supernatural things that happened in the movie industry in the 1920s, involving people like Rudolph Valentino and Alla Nazimova and those sort of shadowy old black and white glamorous figures.
And do you remember the original idea or impetus for writing Medusas Web?
I think I do. Just idly reading for fun, I read a biography of Rudolph Valentino, and it noted that on his deathbed, 2 priests were required to administer last rites. One priest tried it solo and found himself frustrated and had to run off and get a second priest to come and assist. And I thought, what would make that happen? What obstacle did that first priest run into exactly? So I began reading up extensively on Valentino because it had stopped being recreational reading and become research reading at that point. And then inevitably, if you read very deeply in any nonfiction topic, if you are looking for fictionally useful hooks to hang supernatural backstory on, you can't help but find dozens.
Sure. Well, I've heard you describe your elaborate research process for a novel. Was the research for Medusas Web the same?
Yes. As soon as I figured that this anomaly with Valentino was important, I started to read up on everybody associated with him and Hollywood at the time and Hollywood now. And as with every book I plot, I don't arrive with a story. I don't arrive with a plot. I go looking through the research for, as I think of it, things that are too cool not to use. You know, you'll find this strange event, this Natasha Rambova was shot in the leg by her lover, a Russian dancer and choreographer. And you think, okay, obviously that is involved somehow. God knows how at this point, but note it. And after I find 20 or 30 things in the research that are obviously too cool not to use, my task at that point is connect the dots and discover what the plot of the novel will turn out to be. So I really let the research dictate my eventual story. I sort of think of it as a system for somebody who has no intrinsic imagination. Instead of having to make things up, I simply have to find things and recognize them. I suppose there's some virtue in being able to recognize the glittery, useful items.
And do you know what it was about 1920s Hollywood that fascinated you?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Do you know what it was about 1920s Hollywood that fascinated you?
Yeah, it was a very wide open society. There was no income tax, there was no movie code. Everybody was making incredible amounts of money, and every inclination people had could be pursued to the death. Drugs, alcoholism, weird sex, weird occult interests, astrology, fortune telling. It was necessarily brief, because I don't think a society like that can sustain itself very long before burning out, as it did with poor Fatty Arbuckle, who I think was framed, and various murders and descents into madness and suicides. I think the burnout was inevitable, but during its brightly flaring peak, from, say, maybe 1915 to, 1927, when the silent movies ended, it was a fascinatingly libertine society, and not just in the obvious senses of drink and sex and drugs, but weird occult stuff, strange temples in the Hollywood Hills, secret societies, and this kind of mysterious goings-on is especially striking, I think, in that Los Angeles setting, in that sort of sun-drenched palm trees, semi-desert sort of locale.
Sure. And what was the appeal of the occult for those actors and directors and Hollywood types? Was it?
Well, the whole spiritualism fad of the late 19th century was still very strong, and things like astrology were very, popular and relied on. And then, of course, I felt free to exaggerate the actual occult pursuits of all of them. But it wasn't a stretch, because people like Valentino and his quote wife unquote Natasha Rambova, and the Russian emigre Alla Nazimova were fascinated by sort of supernatural influences. In the book, I make much of Nazimova's movie Salome, silent movie, of course. And if you watch that movie, you can't imagine how she imagined that it could ever be popular, because it's murky and obscure and stilted and grotesque, but very spooky, very, very strongly weird. You watch it and you think, okay, what did she really mean by this? She can't have meant it to be, a popular movie like The Sheik. She was meaning something else by it. Right. And of course, I approach all this data with a kind of honorary paranoid schizophrenic squint. I'm not approaching my research the way a rational scholar would. I'm approaching it looking for stuff that could be interpreted as supernatural intrusions.
Gotcha. Well, we're talking about 1920s Hollywood. I'm curious. in terms of modern Hollywood. Your book On Stranger Tides was the basis for the fourth Pirates of the Caribbean movie with Johnny Depp. What was that experience like for you?
Well, it was very nice, of course, because Disney could have said, Powers, you didn't invent Blackbeard the pirate. You didn't invent the Fountain of Youth. Why should we buy this book of yours about those things? So it was very nice that Disney did actually buy the book. And then as soon as they optioned it and began doing work on it, I was thinking, I wonder if they'll, I live only an hour from Los Angeles. I wonder if they'll want me to come along and sit in on a plotting session, which they somehow got along without. But I didn't mind that at all. And then when the movie finally came out, of course, it had nothing in common with my book except Blackbeard and the Fountain of Youth and oceans, ships, swords. But we did get to go watch them filming one evening in Los Angeles and got to talk briefly with Johnny Depp and Rob Marshall, the director. Talked about Hunter Thompson with Johnny Depp. And we got to go to the premiere, and my book came back into print. So really, I think it was the ideal way for such things to work out. I've never figured that movies have any obligation to very closely resemble books they may be based on. I've always figured that if someone were to buy a book of mine and then tell me, well, Powers, we've had to make some changes, it's going to be a animated musical with dancing hamsters, I would say, cool. Carry on.
Great. Well, I know you've talked before about your friendship and interaction with the writer Philip K. Dick. And as you know, interest in Dick's work continues today. The Man in the High Castle is now a TV series via Amazon, and there are discussions of a Blade Runner sequel. What do you think Dick would think of today's world if he were alive? We now live with ubiquitous information, but also there's extensive state surveillance of citizens in the U.S. and abroad. I'm just curious what you think about that.
He would certainly think he had predicted it all. I mean, the way advertisements now, if you go online, they're aimed directly at you. If you bought cat food recently, suddenly you're getting a lot of ads for cat food.
Exactly.
And the way, apparently it's true that new television sets eavesdrop on you unless you specifically turn that function off. And I swear I'm not making this up. They can eavesdrop on your conversations and then tailor advertisements directly to you based on what they heard you say. And certainly that's a very Phil Dick concept. I think he'd be largely alarmed by the current world, but at the same time intensely interested. He was always very involved in, keeping up with political and social developments. One thing I always like to note is that the general caricature of him that seems to be, the popular impression of who he was is very inaccurate. The general impression of Philip K. Dick is that he was a drug-addled hermit who imagined he talked to God all the time. And actually, he was a very rational, funny, very well-read and erudite, and very generous and kind friend.
That's great to know. Well, I know that over the years you've taught writing. What writing advice would you offer for listeners who may be working on their own novels or short stories? Do you have any kind of overarching advice for writers who haven't yet published?
Oh, I suppose I do. Sure. There's obvious advice, but it does no harm to remind people. Obviously, you need to read infinitely. You need to read all the time, all sorts of things, not simply the area you want to write in. Because the wider your reading is, the bigger your toolbox of possible effects is. And of course, you need to write all the time. And I'm echoing Heinlein here, but you need to finish what you write. I know when I was in college, every evening or so, I would write chapter 1 on a piece of paper and write a page and a half. And a couple nights later, I would pull out a fresh piece of paper and write chapter 1 and write a page and a half. So I wound up with 1,000 page and a halves of chapter 1s, but none of them ever went any further than that. And it was a big revelation to learn that it's not enough to write 1,000 words a day. They have to be on the same story until it's finished. And then, of course, you have to get it out to editors. This is all such obvious stuff. It's a good idea to, if you've got a short story, to take away the first couple of pages and let the story start with the next complete sentence. See how it looks that way. It's often an improvement. With novels, it's often a good idea to drop the first chapter and see how it looks if the book starts with what you had thought was the second chapter. Elmore Leonard said, when you're writing a book, leave out the parts that readers skip over, which impressed me. Also, I do like to start in media res, as if you've just switched on a video camera eavesdropping on strangers. So at first, the characters will obviously know what they're doing and why it's urgent, but you, the recently arrived intruder, won't yet know why they're all so excited. You'll catch on gradually as they continue to talk and act. Much better to do it that way, I think, than to prepare with any kind of slow opening, which is supposed to establish characters or something. Like, I like to start with a line of dialogue, and not not immediately give the character's name. It always strikes me that if you start a story with George Jones opened the door and walked down the sidewalk to his mailbox, if you give the character's name in the first sentence, it has a sort of a once upon a time feel. It's sort of telegraphing that this is fiction, this is made up. Another trick I like to use is, I think Hemingway said, you shouldn't stop at the end of a scene or a chapter. You should stop in the middle of some sequence so that next day when you resume work, you're simply continuing something that's already rolling. And I like to take that to the extreme of stop in the middle of a sentence, end the day's work with an incomplete sentence. That way, when you start up next day, it's not going to be like pushing a car uphill to get it started. All you've got to do to begin the day's work is simply complete a sentence, and you're moving.
Sure.
I hope some of that is of use.
Yes. Well, you mentioned earlier your research process and building this, I guess, an outline or framework with all of the research that you've done and kind of connecting the dots between different events that you want to try to weave into your novel. After you've done that, what is kind of your basic writing process? I mean, do you write at a certain time every day? Do you have any kind of, for the lack of a better word, kind of writing rituals yourself? I mean, the reason I asked is you just mentioned about stopping in the middle of a sentence. I was wondering what works for you in terms of a writing process.
Well, once I've got the research all laid out and a plot concocted from it, I like to take a giant sheet of paper, like from an artist's sketch pad, and make a giant calendar with each square a good, 6 inches square. And then I like to write the events of the story in the squares of the calendar. That way I can put that up on the wall and look at it and see what comes next, and what happened a week ago and what's not going to happen for another week yet in the action. And that's a pretty good cure for any kind of writer's block, because you can see what you've got to do next. And right now I mostly write from 8 p.m. till midnight. 4 hours seems like plenty. If I can stay out of YouTube. And I like to do 1,000 words a day. That seems like a generally agreed on decent amount of work for a day. It's only 4 typed pages in the old typewriter days. Mm-hmm. And I have to admit, I always do have the computer. I always have Google ready, because I frequently need to go to Wikipedia to see, well, when was this guy born? Where is this place exactly? And I've found Google Earth terribly useful. You say, well, this corner in Los Angeles or Cincinnati, and it's not going to be a big scene, but I want to establish it. With Google Earth, you can go to that place and drop the little orange man into the street and take a 360-degree view around. Or with YouTube, for example, one story recently, I had somebody on the top of the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and I thought, I've never been up there. How wide is the walkway? How tall is the railing? I assume there's a railing. If you turn around and look behind you, what does the spire look like? Well, obviously, thousands of people have been up there and videoed it and posted it on YouTube. And in fact, any situation you can think of, skiing down Mount Everest, being at the bow of a sailing ship in a storm, you want to describe it, but you hope never to actually be in that position yourself. But somebody has done it and put it on YouTube. But yeah, I do 1,000 words a day when I'm in the writing stage of it. And ideally, my outline and calendar will be thorough enough that I won't have to stop and do some figuring and calculating and plotting and outlining, although inevitably there are periods where I think, wait a sec, you're jumping from here to there. How does that work? And I have to stop and talk to myself in a scratch file to figure it out.
Gotcha. So are there writers or books, either fiction or nonfiction, that you've read recently that you would recommend or mention that kind of struck a chord with you?
Oh, sure. Recently I was thinking of doing a book involving mountain climbing just because I read John Krakauer's Into Thin Air about, I think it was a 1996 expedition to Mount Everest, which went horribly wrong. And there were a couple of points when I was reading it that I thought, you could hang a story on this. And then just for fun, I'm always reading Michael Connelly, sort of Los Angeles police procedural courtroom dramas. He has a new one out that I've got to get. And for kind of retro reading, I have to admit, I'm in the middle of rereading Peter O'Donnell's series about the character Modesty Blaze.
Sure.
Those were from the 1960s mainly, but they're terrific books. If I could write as well as that guy, I would be very pleased.
So what is next for you beyond Medusas Web? Have you started thinking or planning?
Yeah. In fact, I'm just about ready to start writing, I think. I think the research and plotting are very nearly at the point where I could make my calendar. And it's going to be in Los Angeles again, though not a sequel to anything. And it's going to involve freeways, which have always seemed kind of mystical to me. And, of course, supernatural. I find Los Angeles just endless well of possibilities for fiction. It's not as obvious a city as San Francisco, say, or New Orleans or Paris. I mean, anybody can fall in love with those cities in a couple of hours. Los Angeles, you have to kind of spend some time to sort of be charmed by it.
Sure. Well, again, we've been speaking with Tim Powers, author of the new novel Medusas Web, which is on sale now, so go grab a copy. And Tim, thanks for doing this interview.
Oh, you bet. It's been fun.
Find more ways to Black Friday even earlier at Lowe's. Save $140 on our special Buy GE Colorado Pine Pre-Lit Tree, just $158 compared to $298. Plus, Christmas lights everyday low price starting at $298. Black Friday deals live online Thanksgiving Day. Stores open 6 a.m. Black Friday. Lowe's, home to any budget, home to any possibility. While supplies last, tree discount taken at time of purchase, valid through 11/24, U.S. only.
You know when you order a new video game, or a golf club, or a blender, and then it arrives at your door, you get a little thrill. Imagine how much more thrilling it is when you order a new car. With Nissan at Home, you can shop for the perfect ride and order it without ever having to go anywhere. Sure beats a golf club or a blender. Buy a new car entirely online with Nissan at Home. Delivered direct from dealer to driveway. Thrill starts here. Services may vary at participating dealers, subject to applicable law. See dealer for details.